So for this lesson, we're going to talk about our cells. So when we talk about the human body, it's important to understand the human body is made out of a whole lot of cells. It's estimated that there's over 37 trillion cells in our body. So what exactly is a cell? Well, it's the basic unit of life in any living thing. It carries out life process such as eating, reproducing, helping us move, either on its own or as working with other cells like in our body. So how exactly do we see cells? Well, the first way we might use in a science laboratory is through the use of a light microscope. That allows us to magnify the images that we look at. Now, sometimes we need to stain the cells because they're hard to see, but a light microscope is essentially an optical device that uses light to magnify objects, and there's generally a combination of magnifying glasses in the actual microscope used to do it. Now, when we talk about cells, it's important to understand that cells combine in different ways. So there's two particular groupings of cells. There's multicellular groupings and unicellular grouping. If something's considered unicell, we probably only have one cell. That single cell is carrying out the functions that it needs to live. Oftentimes, these are bacteria. And these bacteria are kind of interesting. That's a whole nother discussion. But they have their parts kind of rattling around inside of here in most cases. They may live together with other organisms in a colony, but they're not collectively working together. As in the case of the human body, we're what's considered multicellular. We're considered more complex because all of our cells work together for the purpose of life. Now, when we talk about cells, it's important to understand what exactly cell theory is. Now, that sounds like a fancy word, but essentially this is the rules that explain to us what cells are and what cells can do. So when we look at these different rules, there's three of them. The first is that all organisms are made of one or more cells. So if you're considered a living thing, you're made of one or more cells. This includes bacteria, humans, you name it. Number two, cells are the basic units of all life, and those units help us carry out life functions. That includes eating, reproducing, moving. And all cells come from other cells. In other words, they don't just spontaneously appear from nowhere. Now, it's important to note with these three tenets of cell theory, scientists use these to look for life in other places. So the assumption's made right now, if these are the things that cells do on the planet Earth, and we know cells need certain things, then these same rules apply no matter where you look in the universe. So if we're going to find life on another planet, the assumption is that cells are the basic unit of life, so we will find organisms with cells on other planets. So a question that's often asked by students is, why is it a theory and not a law? It comes back to the third point of modern cell theory. All cells come from other cells. And at this point, we can't exactly explain where the first cell came from. We have a lot of theories, we have some experiments, but that's the reason why this is still cell theory and not necessarily cell law. So one of the interesting things that come up when we talk about this, especially the third point, where do cells come from? There's a theory that was long held before that this occurrence of spontaneous generation would happen, meaning that life just appeared out of nowhere. And that was a very early belief, and it just believed that life could just appear anywhere at any time. And of course, the example that they would look at was if you saw a piece of meat sitting on the table and if you left it sit there for weeks and weeks and weeks, eventually maggots would appear out of the meat. And they believed that maggots just came out of nowhere. Now we know that that's not the case. We know that flies lay eggs, and eggs are maggots, and those develop in the meat. So this is where Francesco Redi comes along. He did a really interesting experiment in the 1600s where he took 8 jars, and 4 of those 8 jars he placed raw meat in. And then another 4 of the 8 jars he put raw meat in, but he covered it with fabric, and he left them sit out. And what he found was that the jars that were open had maggots appear in them, and the jars that were closed didn't. And this is what's called a controlled experiment. And controlled experiments are used to eliminate alternate explanations. And through this, he was able to support item number 3 on modern cell theory.